Welcome to Race Matters, Cultural Politics in the 1960s. My name is Kamara Holloway, and I'm the project manager for the Romare Bearden digital catalog Resonate. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of this webinar lecture series. Over the course of consecutive Thursdays in September, as we remember the anniversary of Romare Bearden's birth, we turn our attention to race, a chief concern in Bearden's work, particularly during the social upheavals of the decade of the 1960s. This series brings together 4 speakers who will shed light on this pivotal moment in our nation's history and consider how artists like Bearden tackled issues related to race in their work. How did artists from a range of racial backgrounds acknowledge the nation's racially charged history? How did they approach depicting a shifting cultural landscape that was responsive to the African-American population's call for sweeping social reform? To shed light on these issues, we have assembled a roster of speakers, starting with Bridget Cooks, who's with us today. In the following weeks, we will have presentations by James Smethurst on September 14th, Maya Harakawa on September 21st, and Helen Sue on September 28th. You can learn more about these talks and register for them on the WPI website. Click on the news and events link at wpi.art. We should have time for questions from the audience at the end of Bridget's presentations. Please post your questions using the Zoom's Q&A box and not the chat. And now to introduce Bridget. Bridget R. Cooks is a scholar and curator of American art. Her research focuses on visual art by African Americans, Black visual culture, and museum criticism. She serves as a Chancellor's Fellow and Professor of African American Studies and Art History at the University of California, Irvine. She is core faculty in the PhD programs in Visual Studies and Culture and Theory. Her books, articles, and essays can be found widely across interdisciplinary academic publications and art exhibition catalogs. She is most well known as the author of the book Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, which was published by University of Massachusetts Press in 2011. And that received the inaugural James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award in African American Art History. Cook's first career was in museum education. In this capacity, she worked at the Oakland Museum of California, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Cooks have curated several exhibitions, including Grafton Tyler Brown Exploring California in 2018 at the Pasadena Museum of California Art, Ernie Barnes, a retrospective at the California African American Museum in 2019, the Black Index, which had a 4-venue national tour during 2021 and 2022, Dissolve in 2022 at the Langston Institute and Museum of California Art, and Lava Thomas, Homecoming to 2022 at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts and the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art. She has received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships from organizations including the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Getty Research Institute, and the California Humanities. Bridget's presentation is titled, Tomorrow I May Be Far Away. And so let's welcome her. Bridget, I turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kamara, for asking me to be a part of this wonderful series. I want to thank Sally Fullerton, who's working behind the scenes to make sure all the technology is working. Catherine Huff, who's also working with the Bearden Project and the Wildenstein Plattner Institute for at large sort of organizing this and working on Bearden's catalog raisonné. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I'll say that what I'm going to present is a combination of research that I've been doing over the past, I will say 20 years, even though I hate to do the math, but I think that's probably true. And I'd like us to really focus on Bearden's career, but also look at the work of just a few other Black artists who were working particularly in the 1960s and facing the same kinds of pressures, overlapping pressures that Bearden did as a Black artist in the art world. So Romare Bearden's significance in American modernism became widely celebrated in the 1960s and 70s through remarkable exhibitions such as projections at the Cordier and Ekstrom Gallery in 1964, and the exhibition Romare Bearden 1940 to 1970, The Prevalence of Ritual at MoMA in 1971. Through these exhibitions, Bearden's skill and vision were shown to have surpassed popular limiting definitions of Black ability as articulated through mainstream art discourses. And at the same time, Bearden embraced Black culture as part of his personal and cultural identity and as the subject matter of much of his work. For art critic for the New York Times, Hilton Kramer, Bearden's interest in Black visibility and modernist aesthetic issues was considered a conflict of interest. In his editorial titled Black Art and Expedient Politics, Kramer states that Bearden's and artist Benny Andrews' participation in the group exhibition titled Afro-American Artists, New York and Boston, expressed a quote, double commitment. And Kramer defines this doubleness as having a commitment to mainstream modernism on one hand, and on the other, the expression of Black subject matter. Kramer explained that, quote, in practice, such an art seems to be extremely difficult to realize. The artist's loyalties remain divided. In Mr. Bearden's work, it is always the cubist structure that dominates. The Black motif is relegated to a secondary epiphenomenal status, end of quote. For Kramer, the Blackness of Bearden's art creates an imbalance and prohibited it from being truly artistically free or successful. Bearden's commitment to both modernism and Black visibility was interpreted as a kind of artistic handicap by the mainstream art world. So in my presentation today, I want to address two key issues in Bearden's exhibition history. First is the two-ness of Bearden's exhibition career in mainstream museums and Black museum venues. And the second is the ironic timing of Bearden's burgeoning mainstream success in the 1960s, when Black artists increasingly became activists for visibility and inclusion in mainstream American art museums. It was during this volatile time in the American political and social sciences, social scenes and sciences, that Bearden's art was revered as exemplary of American art and Black art, two distinct art worlds delineated by institutional racism. So I'm going to explore Bearden's ability to balance these multiple positions that he occupied as a modern Black artist alongside other Black artists working in the 1960s under the same art world constraints and expectations. And so I'm going to show some and talk about some examples, such as including Richard Mayhew, Faith Ringgold, and Bob Thompson. So as early as 1945, Bearden's exhibition career was set in two different paths. Three exhibitions from 1945 illustrate this point. First, Bearden participated in a large group exhibition called The Negro Comes of Age, which was held at the Albany Institute of History and Art. The exhibition consisted of work from well-known leading Black artists, right, from the 306 group, of which Bearden was a member. And he was represented in the Albany exhibition by this work from 1942 titled Factory Workers. Second was Bearden's solo exhibition titled The Passion of Christ, held at the G Place Gallery in Washington, D.C. And this exhibition is considered to be the announcement of Bearden as an independent, unique visionary, right, beyond his student work. And he made the art of his masters his own, as they had done before them. He presented himself as an abstract painter who reinterpreted the passion into a dynamic, modern, and compositionally complex set of images. In this series, the viewer's eye moves continuously in order to digest the action on the surface. This technique in the Passion was the beginning of a compositional trajectory that had become later became fully realized in Bearden's Projection series in 1964. So I'm showing you just one gouache titled "He Is Arisen," which is from the Passion series. Third, a few months after his solo exhibition at G Place, Bearden had his first exhibition at the New Space for Abstract Art, the Coots Gallery in New York. And the Passion of Christ was exhibited along with new works on paper and canvas. The exhibition was met with wonderful reviews, and Bearden was encouraged by the purchase of this work by MoMA in New York. And his art was perceived as equal to his contemporaries, many of whom he exhibited alongside with at the Coots Gallery. So I just want to clarify that there's this dichotomy of exhibition for Bearden and for other artists who were able to reach some level of success and visibility in the presentation of their work. So the dichotomy of exhibiting in mainstream exhibition spaces through literary themes, such as biblical themes like this, in the Passion on one side, and on the other side, you have racially thematic exhibitions, often with racially explicit subject matter. That this was a duality in Bearden's exhibition career from the beginning. This is something I just want to establish now. In his essay, Bearden's essay that he titled The Negro Artist's Dilemma, which he published in 1946, he really started to address this duality and these pressures that he felt that were really a part of his professional career. He addresses this two-ness in the art world by outlining three pressures placed on Black artists that prescribe what their art should be, and briefly paraphrasing the essay and his list. He says, number one, the first pressure is that Black artists should, quote, simulate African art. Number two, they should create the visual equivalents of jazz and spirituals. They should make art that is unlike the white man's style or subject matter. And lastly, their art should reflect the artist's political and social aspirations. So he makes this list and he talks about this as being part of the constraints, meaning he wasn't allowed to sort of make art about anything he wanted to make. He couldn't be shown in multiple spaces because he was Black, and also because his subject matter had a wide diversity from completely abstract, which I'm not showing you this morning or this afternoon, but also ranged to other kinds of topics. And this kind of constraint and expectation is something that we find explored differently by many different artists, all Black artists in the 1960s. So Bearden criticizes these recurring pressures. And he said, quote, the work of the Negro artist reflects all the artistic trends of the times, ranging from the academic to the modern. There is no single characteristic that would stamp their individual works as having been done by a Negro, end of quote. So this is Bearden speaking in 1946. And he argues that because of this range, the exhibition practices of Black art must change. And he said, accordingly, there seems little reason for a continuation of all Negro group shows, aside from the fact that there are no ethnical characteristics that warrant such exhibitions. They tend to hamper the Negro painters by his effort to be sympathetic. End of quote. So I want to move to a contemporary of Bearden's, the great artist Richard Mayhew, who's 99 years old, who has an exhibition opening next month in Sonoma, and just had a wonderful exhibition that just closed in New York. Because I want to help us look at what other Black artists were doing, how they were facing these constraints that Bearden was articulating so clearly in his writing. So Richard Mayhew is an example of one of Bearden's contemporaries and also a friend. I mean, they were in the artistic group Spiral together, which I'll mention in a moment. He faced the same expectations for Black artists, and we can look to see how Mayhew responded to the pressures of anti Blackness, the civil rights movement, art history, and the contemporary art world constraints. So I'm showing you work from 1960. And those of us who may be familiar with Mayhew's work will know that he's known for these kind of pastel and sometimes sort of psychedelically colored um, landscapes that are mostly abstract. They come to him in dreams, in memories. Um, they are an abstraction that help him understand a kind of spiritual nature through what he calls his creative consciousness. So Mayhew worked as an artist and as an activist, as most Black artists had to do in the 1960s. He was a member of Spiral, the legendary group of Black artists whose original members included Charles Alston, Bearden, um, Norman Lewis, who was Spiral's first president, Merton Simpson, Hale Woodruff, and others. And I should say Emma Amos in particular, because she was the only woman who came to be part of the membership eventually. So Spiral was founded in July of 1963 to discuss, quote, what should be their attitudes and commitment as Negro artists in the present struggle for civil rights. Okay. Mayhew remembered how the group gathered together to articulate their, quote, relationship to the oppression in our society in terms of what was going on, the discrimination that was taking place, and certainly discrimination in the arts is no different than in any other area, end of quote. Regarding the name of the group, a statement from the organization explained, quote, as a symbol for the group, we chose the spiral, a particular kind of spiral, the Archimedean one, because from a starting point, it moves outward, embracing all directions, yet constantly upward. The professional and personal bonds that Mayhew formed with the fellow artists in Spiral were the foundation for his community interactions throughout the tumultuous period of social and cultural transformation in the 1960s. And I just want to make sure that we're understanding one of the messages that's coming through in the way that the title, why the title Spiral was chosen. And this idea of moving outward, embracing all directions, gives us a kind of a co-signature on Bearden's understanding of the total wide range of visual expression that Black artists were making in the 1960s. So in 1965, Spiral had their only documented art exhibition called First Group Showing, works in black and white in their Christopher Street space. And all of the works in the show were colored black and white as a commentary on the social problems of race relations at the time. Each artist was represented by one work, and Mayhew submitted a landscape for the exhibition. So for many of us, it may be difficult to visualize a painting by Mayhew in black and white. Only a small number of people were able to see Mayhew's painting in the exhibition because it was not documented. And soon after the exhibition, he painted over the painting, and no record of it remains. So the exhibition of Mayhew's painting in the Spiral exhibition and its subsequent destruction provokes certain questions for me that I will ask and attempt to answer here. For example, how was Mayhew's contribution, a painting heavily influenced by Barbizon and tonalist treatments of the landscape, perceived along abstract expressionist and cubist influenced paintings by people such as Hale Woodruff and Earl Miller, and two other members of the group? How was Mayhew's painting interpreted by viewers in the context of an exhibition that addressed the problems of white violence, exclusion, and discrimination against Blacks? Why did Mayhew continue to paint landscapes during the social turmoil of the 1960s? And as a response to my queries, I'd like to suggest that Mayhew offered a vision of peace and escape in response to social turbulence. Here's another example from 1964. His quiet places of solitude and contemplation offered the possibility of peace of mind and hope instead of chaos. And in this way, Mayhew's active painting mirrored that of 19th century painter, African-American painter Robert Duncanson, the Hudson River School artist who painted American and European landscapes on a grand scale in the years preceding and during the Civil War. Though Mayhew and Duncanson are men of different times and histories, both are men of African descent associated with the Hudson River School, who painted the American landscape in its greatest moments of racial strife. Like Duncanson, whose work has been described as portraying the home that lies over Jordan, the campground where all is peace, Mayhew creates utopian places of rest. His paintings are places of joy and refuge. And Duncanson and Mayhew created compelling visions of spatial freedom during the most poignant moments in the history of Black and white relations in America. Mayhew's painting, alongside his contemporaries, who painted in the modern styles of the day, was truly an appropriate response to the issues that concern the members of Spiral and the nation at large. He presented a visionary Arcadian landscape for all viewers. And I'm making this argument to help us try to understand a possible way to think about and account for this range of expression in the 1960s, right? To help us look at what other Black artists were doing alongside Bearden at the same time. So, although from the perspective of an art historian, the destruction of a work of art is always a valuable loss, Mayhew's active painting over his black and white composition with vivid colors demonstrates his dissatisfaction with the lack of color in the work. And it also serves as a symbolic act of frustration with the hostile racial climate in which we continue to live. Essentially, his work from the Spiral exhibition became the underpainting of a brighter landscape and metaphoric future for its contentious black and white past. So I'm going to go back to Bearden. I'm going to show this painting a few times. Bearden achieved remarkable mainstream success in the art world with his collage-based series Projections in 1964. And this collage-based series is the work that he started as a member of Spiral alongside Richard Mayhew. Exhibited at Corday and Ekstrom Gallery, Projections combined Black figurative imagery with the artist's mastery of formal and compositional concerns. It was well received by the critics. Projections was reviewed as complex, compelling, and exceptional. And I'd like to call attention to the word exceptional here as key to understanding Bearden's exhibition history. So undoubtedly, Projections is exceptional in its reclamation of collage as an American art form and its inventiveness, innovation, and creativity. Bearden was creating a new form of representation that was unlike what any other artist was doing, and he should be celebrated as such. However, Bearden's exceptional artwork was interpreted by some as exempting him of his identity as a Black man. The recognition of Bearden's exceptional talent by the mainstream art world pressured to isolate Bearden from a contemporary context of Black America and recontextualize him solely as a modern artist. So I'm going to show another example of artwork by another artist who was working at the same time, and thinking particularly about the way in which Black artists were trying to navigate being Black and being a modern artist at the same time, because there wasn't a space for that duality or the kind of intersectionality of that identity in the art world. I just wanted to show you, this was the original collage, The Street from 1964, and then this shows the collage with the projection. The projections are black and white. They're a kind of photocopy that really flattens the original collage and changes the intensity and tone of the work. So the projections have at least, it's a multiple processes to make each composition, each object, I should say, but each projection has a collage and then a reproduction. So I wanted to look at Faith Ringgold, right? So through her figurative and abstract paintings, Ringgold has been able to create a space for herself inside the permanent collections of America's greatest art museums eventually. I mean, this has taken at least a generation to really take place. And I think many of you, especially in New York, saw the Faith Ringgold retrospective at the New Museum and felt really confronted with the power of her work, the longevity of her career, the consistency of her vision, right? And this is something that um, kept doors closed to her in the 1960s. So this whole process of her work being becoming canonical in some circles has taken decades. Um, Her acts of resistance outside the art museum as an activist have made space for her and other women artists in art history. And because Ringgold has persistently protested against the art world's anti Black and sexist traditions, her career reveals the difficulties that confront a Black woman artist. She has pushed for the freedom, quote, to say what I please, end of quote. And that's a famous phrase that Ringgold has uttered, that has been a kind of mantra for her success and independence as an artist. Ringgold creates work that inherently functions as institutional critique. And this is evident in paintings from her American People series, which she created from 1963 to 1967, which depict tense moments in interracial social settings in the conservative corporate world. Her Black and white characters are well dressed in business suits for meetings and cocktail attire at parties. And the tone of the series is dark. The figures appear to be gathered in the shadows of tight, airless spaces. In all of the paintings, the corporate world is shady. This is American People, series number 1, Between Friends from 1963. And here we see a brown skinned woman and a white woman filling two sides of the composition. Their bodies are framed by a foreboding red cross that creates a visual barrier between and above them. And the cross matches the dress of the dark woman on the left, who smiles pleasantly and looks directly at the woman before her. Her arched eyebrows make her look surprised and perhaps interested to see her. Maybe if this is her friend, maybe this is someone she doesn't know. In contrast, the older white woman looks straight ahead, avoiding the Black woman's gaze. Her downturned mouth and furrowed brow make her appear unfriendly and uninterested in engaging with the Black woman. Ringgold's painting prolongs this fleeting moment, and viewers can only speculate about the specific context in which this encounter takes place. But by depicting what appears to be a snub, right, or what people today might call a microaggression. I don't believe there's microaggressions. I think they're all just aggression. But by depicting this microaggression, um, Ringgold conveys a sense of antagonism. The satirical title of the work suggests a wasted opportunity. What could have been an alliance of sisterhood between women of different races is instead an acrimonious relationship. Through the symbolism of the Red Cross, Ringgold shows that what keeps these women from being friends is a bloody history of hate, persecution of innocence, and bitterness. And for now, the Christian promise of forgiveness through the cross is a long way off. Um, I want to keep going back to Bearden just because I'm trying to make sure we're seeing part of this range of work that Bearden is talking about. Um, so going back to projections, right? I mean, it's not protest art in, let's say, its most blatant form, right? It's not street posters, it's not popular political icons with bold graphics or text. It does maintain resistance to the dehumanizing treatment of Blacks in America while retaining an aesthetic nuance and innovative techniques that continue to attract viewers to Bearden's work. Indeed, this way of thinking about Black people as humans stands in protest to the treatment of Blacks across the United States that created the need for the civil rights movement. This richness in Bearden's work contested popular understandings of Black Americas. And certainly here, there's a complexity and diversity within the work, that shows the complexity and diversity of Black people. Projections provided a way for Bearden to manipulate media images of Black people. His combination of photojournalist photography combined with his own painting and a variety of images from magazines and art history books create multiple planes and represent the complex composition of everyday people through his memory and his imagination. The reviews of his work were mixed as critics disagreed on the degree of political significance of the work. For example, gallery owner Arnie Ekstrom described projections with this quotation: "They are really extraordinary and constitute a sort of reliving and retelling of his memories as a Negro. The subjects range from burials to cotton fields to jam sessions, Harlem streets, conjure women, etc. In these days of civil rights strife, they are, on the sociological side, a unique statement of pride and tradition, dramatic in many instances, but never a form of protest or agitation. Artistically, they are remarkable." That's the end of the Ekstrom quote. But in that quotation, Ekstrom really depoliticizes Bearden's work. There's a way that he wants to make sure that the person that he's speaking to does not see this work as protest or agitation, right? So there's a way that he has to sort of recover the aesthetic value and dimensions of the work and push its Blackness and its relevance to what's going on in 1964 away. He characterizes projections as disengaged with current social turmoil and emphasizes the expression of pride and tradition. Projections is steeped in Bearden's personal memory and it's relevant to contemporary life. However, Bearden was not making nostalgic works to retreat from the social turmoil of the day. He combined fragments from the past and present to create a rich composite of Black people. So another artist, Black artist working at the same time as Bearden that I want to mention is Bob Thompson. And he reimagined mythical and Christian-based themes, sources that also inspired Bearden and tended to befuddle the critics. Thompson's work can also be considered a response to the times of the 1960s and as a retreat from it in the way that Bearden's and Mayhew's work was perceived. Although Thompson painted Black people in several works, such as this one, Leroy Jones and His Family, he was a prolific painter of old master subjects. Like Bearden, Thompson was a very learned student of the arts. In the last years of his life, in the 1960s, he spent time absorbing the artistic treasures of museums and galleries in Europe. He studied art and reinterpreted the great compositions of European old masters. And he internalized their language of expression and was able to engage with it from his perspective. He was excited by the rich experience of seeing in person the art that he'd only seen in art history books. And I have a quotation from Thompson just expressing this. He says, "I went to Europe. The museums were driving me crazy. I was seeing so much art. And then I thought that, my God, to look at Poussin and he's got it all there. Why are all these people running around trying to be original when they should just go ahead and be themselves?" And that's the originality of it all. Just be yourself. Now you can't do nothing. You can't draw a new form. The form has already been drawn. I work with these things that are already there because that is what I respond to most of all. And I think painting should be the format or the foundation, should be like the theater, a presentation of something, some activity, not only to expose the ability of the artist, but also for the viewer to relate, like the painters in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Painters were employed to educate the people. They could walk into a cathedral, look at the wall, and see what was happening. I'm not specifically trying to do that. I have much more freedom, but in a certain way, I'm trying to show what's happening, what's going on in my own private way. So there's lots to say about this quotation, which I don't have time to fully go through. But just even in this example, you can see how he Bob Thompson is going back and forth looking at this historical art in Europe, um, being totally inspired and sort of jazzed by it, right? Energized by it. And then um, relating to it and saying, I can look at this material, source material, to talk about my original self, to just be who I am. And he was able to do this because he really identified with, I think, the shapes of the work, which you see that he reproduces in silhouette in his own style. But also, there's a lot of drama and struggle and strife. So, an example of this is the execution from 1961. So, here we have Thompson's rendition of a work by Fra Angelico, which dates back to 1438 to 1440, and I'll show you that, titled The Beheading of St. Cosmas and St. Damian. And when we look at Bob Thompson's work, and I encourage people to look at his work, there was a show that recently traveled that was organized by the Colby Museum that went across the country. And often we're looking at source material like this, and then we're looking at Bob Thompson's reimagining of it. So we have these beheaded saints here at the bottom. We have these beheaded figures here. And then we have this active figure in both works who is swinging a stick. Thompson shows that racial violence is what's going on in America by looking to Fra Angelico and then making his reinterpretation of it, again called The Execution. Like other expatriates, Thompson may have enjoyed the racial freedom that he experienced in Europe, but he used what he found there to further illuminate the plight of being Black in America. In Fra Angelico's painting, the blindfolded twin St. Cosmas kneels before the executioner in the moment of becoming a martyr. His head is already crowned with a halo of sainthood. The figures of three other Christian saints, the twin brothers, lie beheaded on the bottom right corner of the composition. So these are the figures that I mentioned down here. To the left, a crowd of men engage in conversation behind St. Damien, who waits on his knees to be executed. And so we can see this character here. The scene takes place on a road beside a fort, nestled in a hilly Syrian landscape with grass, cypress trees, and other forts in the distance. The twins were physicians who were killed for not charging patients for their services, and their deaths were recorded as a series of tortures, crucifixion, stoning, and shooting with arrows before the final beheading. In The Execution, Thompson shows St. Cosmas hanging from a tree. His executioner holds a bloodied purple rod behind his back, ready for a maximum force swing. The hanging body's upright position and elevated height makes the scene look more like a brutal flogging or celebratory hitting of a piñata than a beheading. The three decapitated corpses below the action clarify the grisly situation. The twins are depicted as Black silhouettes, recalling the dark figures that appear in many of Thompson's earlier works of violence and revenge in the woods. And the transfiguration of men into saints is not replicated in The Execution. And I'm looking here at the absence of the halos. I'll show this together. The connotation of beating and beheading references the saint's torture and likens it to the multiple forms of torture that is common in American lynching. Painting through the Western art historical tradition allowed Thompson to express his epic narrative of pain and punishment that we see throughout his work. He created a visual language analogous to the old masters that translated his struggles into the foundations of art history. I mean, these are the same kinds of words that we can use when we're talking about the kind of work that Bearden did. So again, just to look at this kind of similar navigation between the past and the present, between art history and contemporary art in the 20th century, right? This is something that we see in Thompson's work as well as Bearden's work. Okay. In the installation of the exhibition, The Art of Romare Bearden at the National Gallery of Art, there was a gallery titled Mecklenburg Memories that contained a quotation from Bearden in the wall text. And in the quotation, Bearden explains most artists take some place, and like a flower, they sink roots, looking for universal implications. My roots are in North Carolina. Bearden sought to portray the dignity of the people that he remembered there. His project to turn to his roots would help redefine misconceptions of, quote, the old Negro in the visual arts as part of a simpler time with simpler people. And here I'm thinking particularly about Alain Locke um, and his definition and discussion of the old Negro versus the new Negro, a kind of social and artistic transformation for Black people in America that happened with the Harlem Renaissance. Um, I would say that it's helpful to also point out the commonalities that we see in Bearden's work between people through what he was calling universal implications, right? He was interested in not reinforcing a racial hierarchy and ideology of a segregationist past, but still wanting to revere and respect and show his admiration for people who lived in rural communities. So I suggest that Bearden's desire to return to this rural past in his work also coincides with the conservative art world desire for an American past, a mythic, idyllic moment before the civil rights movement when Black people, quote unquote, knew their place. I'm going to illustrate these different possible interpretations of Bearden's collages as reverent depictions of rural roots on one side and conservative social nostalgia on the other by analyzing one of his works from the 1960s. So this one, Tomorrow I May Be Far Away from 1966 to 1967, shows three figures in an agricultural setting. Okay, just so we see them all. Here's one, here's two in the middle, and then there's a woman here to the right. On the left, a woman stands in the corner of a wooden house. She looks through a window with two incompatible eyes. The small eye looks downward towards the ground outside, and the left eye, the large bright eye of an infant, looks upward with a sense of hope and wonder. Her oversized fingers spill out of the window frame, grasping the exterior wall. And sitting outside of the house in the center of the composition is a man smoking a cigarette. He leans toward the woman in the house, hands crossed between his knees. The fragmentation of the composition, particularly the surface of the wooden home, suggests the meager means of the couple and their industriousness to create something from nothing. On the right side, a woman carrying a watermelon approaches their door. Her gesture of sharing fruit from her yard suggests the strength of their community. The scene suggests that their economic situation is difficult, yet they manage to survive and take care of one another. At the top of this composition is a smoking train, and we know that we see trains over and over, sometimes in the same composition created by Mayhew. And it suggests that there are at least two worlds with the train running as the conduit between them. The title, Tomorrow I May Be Far Away, and the train as the articulation between the North and the South, Harlem and Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, suggests a commentary about social change. Bearden depicts the couple as visionaries who, at the end of the day, the moment in which he chose to depict them, they think about what is on the horizon, and perhaps they will take their skills and hopes on that train and tomorrow find themselves far away. The argument Bearden makes through this image provides a background history to the people who demanded social change in the 1960s. It shows them as dignified people who understand the value of hard work, who have contributed to the fabric of America, and who rightfully seek a better life in the urban North. And I think I'm going to conclude just with this last paragraph so we have some time for question and discussion. An interpretation of this collage that would support a conservative ideology against the civil rights movement may also understand the composition as a group of simple Negroes who live in a primitive rural environment. The discontent suggested by the face of the woman in the house, with one eye looking thoughtfully at the ground and the other looking upward into the unknown. Let me go back. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Um, may be read as evidence of confusion in a childlike persona, incompatible with the civility and sophistication of city life. The image of a Black woman holding a watermelon approaching the house would fulfill stereotypes for some about Black Americans' obsession with watermelon. And perhaps the composition would appear as the picture of contentment in the Old South. During the 1960s, the scene may have consoled some viewers with the suggestion that some colored still know their place. So I'm going to stop here. I think you can tell that there's more, and even if I read the entire thing, there's still more to say and more to think about. But I think I'd rather hear from some other people and their thoughts about this. The last thing I'll say is what I'm hoping I was able to get across is that we have Black artists in the 1960s who are faced with impossible pressures. Um, they are facing impossible pressures because they live in an anti-Black society, right? And the kind of pressures that Bearden explains, and Thompson explains, and Mayhew and Faith Ringgold explain, right? Right. These are larger social issues, and they're all trying to navigate a way to be successful as visual artists, to navigate the expectations of what a great American artist should be. For Bearden, I think a great sort of universal artist would be, and Thompson as well. And through those pressures, create their own visual lexicon, right? To show their individual perspective, to be who they are, to say what they please, um, in a kind of catch-22 situation, right? Because the playing field says that you can't be a great artist and be Black at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Clara.
People can put their questions in the chat, in the Q&A box if they have any. And I want to ask you to say a little bit more about Tomorrow I May Be Far Away.
Yeah.
It's one of the works that was featured in the Time magazine article of 1967 that was a review of Bearden's Cordier and Ekstrom exhibition. And I'm wondering what it is that you think and what people at the time might have think would have made this such an emblematic work.
Yeah, I think my first response to that is technique. I mean, there's something really exciting about the way that he's creating a unified picture that is full of fragmentation, right? That there's this tension through thinking about process, right? How does he make something that coheres from all of these different sources? And, you know, when Irvine did the exhibition, The Art of Romare Bearden at the National Gallery, there was this wonderful breakdown of this collage that talked about the different sources for the different kinds of images that we see, right? The paper themselves, but then also socially thinking about what he's saying when he puts them all together. So this is a work that I think would be very difficult to just sort of approach, stand there for the 1.2 seconds that American visitors are timed on average looking at an artwork, and just move on. There's a lot going on here. And you can look at it in terms of materials, process, subject matter, tone, sources. I think for the mainstream art world, like with the Ekstrom quotation that I read, it's possible to sort of sell the work, and I mean commercially, but also sort of sell it to people as something that they see as worth looking at. It's possible to sell it without thinking about Blackness. Just in terms of process and materiality, people can see, wow, a lot of work went into this. There was a kind of draftsmanship that's part of why this is so difficult to walk away from. And that Bearden sort of walked that line. I don't think he did it purposefully. He wasn't trying to make work that appealed to white people. But in terms of perception of his work, there was enough here visually for some people who weren't interested in civil rights, who did not like Black people, right? To say, I can still look at this work, even though there's Black people in it, and appreciate it for its technical um, uh, excellence.
Okay. And so what do you think about Bearden's shift from working in mainly abstraction to working in figuration? And he sort of says something about how the Black figure returns to his consciousness and demands to be put into the visual field that he's working in. And the other artists that you were speaking about also tended to work in illusionistic modes. And what is it that you think about the time period that really sort of demands that you work figuratively, that you work with illusionism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways to answer the question. There's a kind of luxury of freedom of expression that Black artists just have never had. Um, and this is not even solely in the art world. I mean, we think about Spike Lee, who's someone who was really spoken about the pressures that he has been under as a Black filmmaker, the kind of questions that he gets from critics. That he says, you'd never ask Woody Allen that question. Why are you asking me? So there it goes back to those expectations of what Black artists should be doing. I think what we find with Bearden and other artists who sort of came of age artistically through abstract expressionism in the 1950s, Hale Woodruff, Norman Lewis, of course, even Alma Thomas, right? I mean, thinking about how in schools you were taught to recreate the master's works, right? And Faith Ringgold has talked a lot about this as being something that became an obstacle for her to really develop her mature work that she's known for. Um, Being part of an abstract expressionist time period, we see that fully in Romare Bearden's work in the 1950s. And then as we go into the 1960s, I think because of what was going on socially, I think because of his frustration and other Black artists' frustration with how their work was being discussed by critics, and perhaps by other Black artists who were like, what are you doing? I mean, Richard Mayhew has gotten this his whole life by some people. It's 1968, it's 1972, it's 19. How are you making trees? How can you do fully abstract work? I think now when we think about contemporary artists that are Black who make abstract work, there's more understanding, I'm knocking on wood here, more understanding that part of the resistance and activism of being a Black artist is to refuse those pressures, those limitations of what Black artists should be doing, what their art should look like. In Bearden's work, we see him trying to create a balance between abstraction and the figurative, right? We know that he can do fully abstract work, but he also is thinking about Blackness itself as an abstraction, right? To think about the composite figures, how each of us are made up of pieces of every experience we've ever had, every person we've ever met, and to try to make a kind of universal appeal so that people can see perhaps Black people can be universal. Perhaps we can be considered human by identifying with these kind of composite figures made up of all kinds of different sources. So it's not a clean answer, but those are some of my thoughts around that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thinking of the artist and then thinking about the museums, how does that museum landscape really embrace or not embrace what the artists are doing?
Yeah.
Are they putting them in the exhibitions, or is it still all segregated African American shows?
Yeah. I mean, so in the 1946 essay that I read a quotation from Bearden, um, sort of from that context, when he says, you know, that time for all Negro shows is over. And yet he continues to be in all Negro shows. And he continues to, later in his life, you know, really become an important champion of art collections and art departments at HBCUs. You know, he shows at the Studio Museum, but he's also showing at MoMA at the same time. He writes with Harry Henderson a book on, which is really kind of encyclopedia of Black artists. Um, I think that he was frustrated with the institutional split between art and Black art, but wanted to, because he was interested in these ideas of universals, to be seen by people of different communities. And so he showed work in both kinds of spaces. Um, I
Okay.
mean, Bearden had to do so much, right? He writes a book that's with Carl Holty, completely about technique and solving problems of form, right? It's like for artists. And then, as I said, he writes the book with Harry Henderson about Black artists. I mean, there's so much duality where he's totally aware of um, the racism and segregation in the art world. The art world doesn't integrate, right? He has to decide to be on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. So did other periods of, this is a question from the audience, did other periods of intense social upheaval produce similar artistic impulses? Like, has there been other moments that are comparable to like the 1960s, and has the response been similar?
Yeah. Did you want, are we waiting for someone from the audience?
No, somebody, that was a question that they had.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood. Well, we're in it. I mean, right? Black Lives Matter. And I think when people ask this question, they know that, you know, we're in a parallel moment. So we're seeing exhibitions like Black American Portraits, right? Which opened at LACMA and went to Spelman, um, where we have a focus on the Black figure, right? It's not an all Black show because not all of the artists were Black, but the pictures, right? The representations and all the work was of Black people. Um, there's a reason why figuration is still relevant for Black people today. We're still, I think, um, needing the validation of our existence, needing that feeling of excitement to see the diversity and the beauty of who we are and the complexity and contradiction of who we are in
Okay,
art.
great.
Um, but
Well,
there's,
we're at the hour, so we have to stop, but I want
okay,
to thank you for joining us and being so generous with your time. So please join me in thanking Bridget Cooks for kicking off our Race Matters lecture series. Be sure to tune in the same time next week on September 14th, when we'll have James Smethurst, who will be talking about the South and the Southern Black Arts Movement. The link to register can be found on our webpage at wpi.art. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you again for the rest of the Race Matters lecture series. So thanks, Bridget.
thank you
And
so much. Thanks everybody who's here.